The title of this study is Beloved Enemy. I know it sounds a little bit of a conflict, contradictory. How can an enemy be beloved? But one of the most radical and often quoted instructions of Jesus is actually considered to be very unreasonable. And this teaching that he gave one day on the mountain in Israel, giving the beloved Sermon on the Mount, one of the strangest things that people would have heard that day was when Jesus said the following in Matthew 5, verse 43. You have heard that it hath been said, Thou shalt love thy neighbor and hate thine enemy. But I say unto you, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you. One of the most challenging things that Jesus gave. You see, the Jews had used God's law to imply an addition. God had said, because it says here, you have heard that it hath been said, thou shalt love thy neighbor. God's law does say, love your neighbor. But what had become a tradition was that if God says, love your neighbor, then it's okay to hate your enemy. God never said that, but that was how the Jews interpreted Scripture. It says God specified that you are to love your neighbor, but therefore then your enemy, that's justified, it's okay to hate him. That's why Jesus says here, you have heard that it hath been said, thou shalt love thy neighbor and hate thine enemy. That was a tradition, that was understanding, that was justified to dislike, to hate enemies. And so Jesus says here, but I say unto you, love your enemies. I want you to think of the listeners of Jesus, because the Jews living at the time were under the rule of Rome, persecuted, abused, and Jesus says this, not only love your enemies, as in your heart, in your mind, but actively demonstrate that love in your behavior. Right? You know, it's easy to say, well, I love someone, if all you have to do is just say that or think about it in your mind. But no, here he says, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you. Very, very radical, very, very difficult. And it's even forgotten many times that Jesus also identified who the enemies are. You see, the enemies here are actually close at hand, not afar off. It's easy to love an enemy at a distance. That is distant, or at a distance. Meaning, someone you don't see as much, someone you hear about who does these terrible things and things that you don't agree with and that you would regard as an enemy and say, well, you know, Jesus says I have to love them. So you think, okay, I love them, and they are at a distance. That's not too hard to do, but Jesus identified who the real challenge and where the real enemies will be. And it's in another verse, in Matthew chapter 10, verse 36. He says, and a man's foes shall be they of his own household. Now the word foes here is the exact same word as enemies that we read in the previous verse. It's not a different word, it's the same word. A man's enemies are they of his own household. These are the actual harder enemies to love. Right? That's the real challenge. Enemies that are close at hand, that we have to do with, that have an impact on us, whether they persecute us, whether they oppose us, whether they despitefully use us, whether they say all manner of things against us. Enemies that we have to deal with, perhaps day in and day out. They're close at hand. They're much harder to actually love than those enemies that are at a distance that we probably never see. A man's enemies are they of his own household. When we talk about household here, it's not just talking about the blood family, okay? This is talking about the church family, family of faith, school family, work family, whatever association of people that you are in that forms a certain collection, household or of sorts, structure. Thank you. He says that there will be animosity there. Now in the context I realize Jesus is saying that because of what he says, some will accept it and some will not, and some family members will be turned against each other, and a man's enemies will be they of his own household. That's in the context. But many times you find that the enemies that are harder to love and exercise that towards are those that are close at hand. those that might be in church saying something against us, those that might even be family members. I'm not going to go through examples as far as today and all the different scenarios. You can, consider them, you can imagine them yourselves. There's so many stories. But I want to look at the point where does God live by this instruction as well? And what can we learn from another story recorded in the Old Testament? An insight into the Father's heart that will help us understand something and maybe see it in a different perspective. And the story I want to look at illustrates for us this dilemma very, very adequately, that a man's enemies are they of his own house, and how such enemies are much harder to deal with. And yet, this story shows us parallels with another story. Let me tell you what the stories are so you don't get lost trying to guess this one and then the other and lose track of what stories. The story I want to explore today a little bit is the story of David and Absalom, where we had a domestic feud between King David and his son that threatened to overturn the whole kingdom. It was a rebellion, mutiny. And the story of the rebellion of Absalom against David is full of lessons because it has parallels with the other story of another son of a king who also desired his throne long ago in heaven. Lucifer by name. Amazing parallels. And we'll see what we can learn as we go along. Parallels that also have relevance for us today as well. They're not just stories of two stories that are related far away, long ago. They actually have very interesting lessons for us today. The tactics that were used, the issues that played out, have an uncanny similarity, even to this day. Issues that occur among us. Underhanded subterfuge, all manner of undercurrent issues that exist. Interesting story. So let's summarize quickly so we can have it in context. I want to pick some highlights and draw some parallels and see what we can work out together. In 2 Samuel chapter 11, we won't turn there just yet. We'll get there in a minute. Well, I have it here actually. I didn't put this verse in. Let me fix this up here right quick while we're talking. In 2 Samuel chapter 11, we have the story of King David and Bathsheba. Remember that story? King David was walking on the roof of his house. He sees Bathsheba and he is captivated, and he decides to do something that he shouldn't do, especially as a king. Let me put that verse here and we'll read it. 2 Samuel chapter 11 verse 2 and 3. And it says the following. And it came to pass in an eventide that David arose from off his bed and walked upon the roof of the king's house. And from the roof he saw a woman washing herself. And the woman was very beautiful to look upon. And David sent and inquired after the woman. And one said, Is not this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? I think you know the rest of the story. David, of course, takes Bathsheba. He has a plan to hide it when he finds out she's pregnant. It doesn't work, so he decides to have Uriah killed. And this major blunder of David brought him no end of trouble for the rest of his life. Even though he repented, even though he was forgiven, the resultant consequences from this major blunder continued to plague David and his household for the rest of his life. That's actually what the prophet told him, that the sword would not depart from his house. And one of these consequences was what eventually happened in the story with Absalom. But I want to give it a little bit of context so we can understand what is really going on. You see, in a few chapters later, in 2 Samuel chapter 13, we find the story of David's firstborn son, Amnon. And what happened there? Well, let's read verse 1. I'm going to summarize the story. 2 Samuel 13:1. And it came to pass after this, that Absalom, the son of David, had a fair sister whose name was Tamar, and Amnon, the son of David, loved her. Now, if you remember the story, what ended up happening was Amnon basically raped his sister, his half-sister. I'm trying to put it mildly, but that's what ended up happening. Amnon got some advice, pretended he's sick. He lusted after her. What was happening here is he lusted after her, and so he pretended to be sick. She came and asked for her to be his nurse, and she came and he basically forced her and he laid with her. The news gets to Absalom, and he is enraged because his sister was defiled by Amnon. David did nothing to Amnon, which enraged Absalom all the more. What had happened was David's sin is what actually emboldened Amnon to do what he did. And because of David's sin and his guilt, he didn't feel like he could do something to Amnon because he did something not too different. You with me? And so it gave rise to this problem. It's recorded in the scriptures. It's a terrible tragedy. It's just the context and backdrop of what's happening. The point is not to relay these and sadly bemoan what happened. We can't just ignore them. They're details and they actually help us understand certain things. So Absalom is enraged and vows to avenge his sister's honor. He puts her at home, and for 2 years he plots a plan to avenge his sister. He didn't go speak to Amnon. He didn't do anything to him. 2 years passed by. And then after 2 years, he hosts a party, invites all the king's son, and when Amnon was there and drunk, he got his servants to kill his half-brother in retribution for what he had done to his sister 2 years ago. The news travels, and as news travels to the king, they hear that all the king's sons have been killed by Absalom. And here is the account in 2 Samuel 13, verse 32. And Jonadab, the son of Shemaiah, David's brother, answered and said, "Let not my lord suppose that they have slain all the young men, the king's sons. For Amnon only is dead. For by the appointment of Absalom, this hath been determined from the day that he forced his sister Tamar." So it was only Amnon who was killed. Of course, Absalom does the deed and he escapes and goes into voluntary exile. He hides in another city away from Israel for 3 years. Okay, you can do good homework for Sabbath afternoon one time. Read the story and get the details. I'm just giving you some highlights. We're going to get to the meat of it in a minute, but the context is vital actually to understand the lead up to it and what actually took place. So Absalom is enraged. Absalom is escapes for 3 years. He's in hiding, and David is crying for the loss of his son Amnon, and no doubt feeling a certain measure of guilt because he caused all of this by his sin. What he had done had opened the floodgates, so to speak. After some time, David permits his son Absalom to return back to Jerusalem after 3 years. So he lost Amnon, he's comforted for his son's death. Absalom is also his son, and he loves his son. And what a tragedy, one son kills the other son. And so after 3 years, he allows Absalom to come back to Jerusalem. So this is the account. We read it, 2 Samuel 14, verse 23. So Joab arose and went to Geshur and brought Absalom to Jerusalem. And the king said, "Let him turn to his own house, and let him not see my face." So Absalom returned to his own house, and saw not the king's face. And so Absalom, verse 28, and so Absalom dwelt 2 full years in Jerusalem, and saw not the king's face. Well, I guess King David was in a bit of a dilemma. How he could relate and what he could do. And he kind of partially forgave Absalom, right? So it's okay, you can come back, but not fully enough where you can actually see him. So Absalom escapes for 3 years, comes back and lives in Jerusalem for 2 more years, and he does not get to see the king or go have a face-to-face with his father for 2 years. And after 2 years, Absalom is kind of sick of this situation. Being half forgiven is probably worse than being not forgiven, where you kind of come a little bit but not all the way. It's a good lesson for us about forgiveness and what measure of forgiveness we exercise. And when you have forgive someone, how it impacts them, no matter how evil the deed was, as Absalom's most certainly was. So, after 2 years, he's fed up, and he plots a very daring and outrageous plan. Because keep in mind, Absalom was not just upset at his brother Amnon for what he did to his sister, but he also must have been disappointed that his father did nothing to Amnon, and he had to take matters into his own hand and kill his own brother to serve what he believed was justice. So he's cooking up this plan in his mind, this very ambitious plan. A plan that will see him dethrone his father David and sit on his throne, because David was not worthy to be king. Absalom is. And he had a plan to do just that. Take his father down. Now that starts sounding familiar, like another story where the prince wanted to dethrone his king, the father king, and sit on his throne. That's the story of what actually happened in heaven. A loyal son rebelling against the king. And he was not just a son, but he was a handsome son at that too. We're told 2 Samuel 14:25. But in all Israel, there was none to be so much praised as Absalom for his beauty, from the sole of his foot even to the crown of his head. There was no blemish in him. Here is a handsome son. Actually, it tells us a little later that yearly he would cut his hair, and at the time, having maybe long hair was a sign of being handsome and princely and royal, and he would weigh his hair. He had thick hair apparently, and he was just a very pretty boy. If we were to put it that way, handsome. Not in a bad way, but he was just handsome. He was a beautiful. Israel, that was his reputation. He was known to be handsome. And here he is in Jerusalem, and he's still somehow under the punishment of the king, because he doesn't get to see his father. For 2 years he's sick and tired of that. Now that reminds us of someone else who was also very handsome. Lucifer in heaven was perfect in all his ways when he was created. In Ezekiel 28:15 it says, speaking of Lucifer, "Thou wast perfect in thy ways, from the day that thou wast created till iniquity was found in thee." 2 handsome sons with a very similar plan. The parallels are actually unmistakable. Lucifer is described as having tabrets and pipes. He's described as being filled with stones and jewels, his adornment. He was a very beautiful angel. And that generated a certain sense of pride. The Bible describes him as being perfect in beauty, according to God. Lucifer was. Yes?
When it says he had pipes and tabrets, is that just a metaphor to say that he had the ability to change the voice into those sounds?
Okay, that's a good question. The pipes and tabrets, what does that signify? It does signify his ability to sing in a marvelous way. That's what I would understand that to mean. So he had an incredible ability. No, we wouldn't imagine that there was an actual musical instrument as part of him, but what he could accomplish by singing was so musical. And so he was perfect in beauty. The Bible says he was wise. He was singing around his tent. He was a leader in the choir of heaven. And he had this plan. He was disgruntled for some reason or other with the king and wanted to rebel. Now there is a difference here. Absalom felt he had some reason that justified why he was disgruntled with David. Lucifer did not have any just reason to be disgruntled with God. Yes, it wasn't a just reason. He felt it was that way, but I understand this because he wanted to be in the council. I'll say that so that everyone can hear it. He felt that he was not treated as he deserved. He felt he deserved so much more. He was perfect, and pride got to him, and he aspired for more than what was possible for him in his status as a created being. He desired to be as the creator. So they were both very similar. Both are sons, both scheming to capture the throne, both are handsome, and both used similar tactics. Actually, Absalom's tactics, because Lucifer's rebellion was first, were actually inspired by Satan, as we shall see. Let's read it together and see what it's described as. 2 Samuel 15, verse 1 to 4. And it came to pass, after this, that Absalom prepared him chariots and horses, and 50 men to run before him. And Absalom rose up early, and stood beside the way of the gate. And it was so, that when any man that had a controversy came to the king for judgment, then Absalom called unto him and said, Of what city art thou? And he said, Thy servant was of one of the tribes of Israel. And Absalom said unto him, See, thy matters are good and right, but there is no man deputed of the king to hear thee. Absalom said moreover, Oh, that I were made judge in the land, that every man which hath any suit or cause might come unto me, and I would do him justice. What was happening here? So let me back up just a little bit to fill in the gap. So 2 years, Absalom is upset that he can't see David, finally makes a request, forces Joab to come to him. He goes to see David, and now he takes the opportunity to stand in the gate of the king's court, palace, and to see how he can interact with the people who were coming, because the custom was in the day that if anyone had a dispute or a matter, they would go to the king, and the king would settle it and make a judgment. And before these people would get to the king, sometimes there would be a long line, sometimes you don't get to it straight away, there's other people who are wanting that. Absalom would be there and talk to the people, Where are you from? What happened? And he would give them basically that which would be favorable in their eyes as far as judgment. And he'd say, you know what? If I was a judge, if I was in the place of a king to pass these judgments, he wasn't just asking to be an appointed judge. He says, if I was in a place of being king, to be able to determine these things, it would be such a wonderful thing, because I would do so much justice. And he would say this in the ears of the people, and people would go away and be so happy, say, the king's own son came and met me personally and told me this. And through this method, Absalom gained the loyalty and the respect and the favor of the people who were aggrieved. And he continued to do that for a number of years, actually. Now, underhanded, sweet talking to win the hearts of the people. To tell them that which would be pleasing to them, but he had an ulterior motive. He had a plan that was not revealed to these people. This is the key here. You see, Absalom planted seeds in the hearts of the people that alienated them from the king and turned them towards Absalom. That was his full-time job. And he did that continually. That's exactly what happened in heaven, if you remember. Lucifer won the hearts of a third of the angels. And with time, and with whispering and scheming, he managed to convince 1/3 of the angels to turn their allegiance from God to him. I want you to stop and think about that for a minute. These are holy angels of God who go into the presence of God in heaven. And through this tactic of whispering over time, shifting the sympathies, Lucifer managed to alienate a whole third of them from God and join his rebellion. What hope do we have, to meet with the deceptions and insinuations of Satan? Only Christ is able to cause us to see through it. You see, the angels, like the people that Absalom talked about, did not fully realize Lucifer's ulterior plan. He did not fully reveal everything in his mind. But slowly, a word here, a seed there, in the hearts and the minds of the angels, he would gain their sympathy to his cause, which they partially understood, until it eventually ripened to a full rebellion. So let's put this in perspective today, because I said there are lessons today that we can learn about this. In like manner, today, among us in the church, as a people, we find that there are those who play the part of Absalom, who might be handsome in the sense that they are talented with words, with speech, who are able to win the hearts and sympathies of people towards them and away from where it should be. And what you end up with is people who follow a certain speaker or a certain leader that they have grown to love and respect, no matter what they say. Sound familiar? How that's accomplished is through the same tactic that Lucifer used in heaven, that Absalom demonstrated, that within the very presence and the court of the king, right there at the gate, he was actually working and planting his seeds to turn people against the very king that they served. Swaying people's judgment and sympathies. You see, the Bible actually tells us, and this is a very interesting point I want to emphasize here, in Proverbs chapter 18, verse 17. This very interesting proverb, this verse says the following: "He that is first in his own cause seemeth just, but his neighbor cometh and searcheth him." Does that make sense to you? It didn't to me when I read it. I'm like, okay, that sounds like a very wise, profound thing Solomon wrote there. What does it mean? What's he saying? So if you look it up in another translation, it's a lot easier. Here it is. "The first to put forth his case seems right, until someone else steps forward and cross-examines him." Makes a bit more sense? What the wise man is saying here, what this proverb is about, is simply this: the first one to get his story in someone's ear usually influences them stronger. Usually people will hear one side of a story and they will side with that which they heard, depending on the person who said the story or communicated whatever information was chosen to be communicated. Many times people don't stop and say, hold on, there must be another side to this story, let me find out. They run with whatever influence they received, they make a judgment, it colors their discernment, and they side with what they heard. That's what he's saying. The first to put forth his case seems right. Sometimes you might hear a story that seems so convincing, you think, I don't even need to hear the other side. This is so convincing.
You said, well, the Democrat.
No comment. You with me? It is so vital to be able to understand, to see things in their big picture. Absalom was presenting to the people his version of the story, his view of things. Satan in heaven, when he was Lucifer, was presenting his view of things. Even today among us, brothers and sisters, we have to beware of hearing and deciding based on a one-sided story. Even if it got on your ears first. When it comes to stories, or even when it comes to doctrine, even when it comes to preaching, so many people get influenced when they hear someone and they judge the other side without hearing it, because what they heard from that someone sounded so convincing. They don't go through a process of cross-examination. And the way to successfully do that is to speak and communicate your story to others behind the scenes, secretly, on the quiet. Whisper a little word here, a little word there. Plant a seed. That's what Lucifer did. That's what Absalom did. That's what happens among us. You realize that? And it causes all kinds of alienation. The thing that I have observed, and the thing I want to share with you from this verse, this particular point here, is that people fall for the words of the one who speaks more than the silent one. What I mean by that is this. When someone who's speaking, who's decimating, selling a story, people fall for that and they don't notice the other side who might be quiet and not saying anything. And they make a judgment based on what they hear. So this is why I'm saying people fall for the words of the ones telling the story and they don't hear what is not said. The silent ones, they don't consider that. And that's a very dangerous thing. That's a very dangerous thing to fall into. Even particularly, not just even, in every circumstance this is important, but particularly when you're in a situation when you are seen as someone who will be a judge or an arbiter, when we're seen as a spiritual leader, it is most dangerous to judge a matter from hearing one side. You know, many times I have people talk to me and they will tell me their story, and then they usually have a suggestion as to what I now need to do to act in their behalf in what they feel would be just. And they suggested, they don't tell me do this, but it's insinuated and suggested, and they present a very convincing case. And, you know, initially, maybe if one is not experienced enough, you say, yeah, that happened, they said this, no, this is wrong, I'll fix it. And you ring the other party and you let them have it, or whatever it is. You know, you quickly learn that that is not a wise way to judge matters. So what I've learned to do now is tell people, thank you, I've heard you out, and I understand you want me to do this. Let me give it some thought and prayer, and usually I will seek to find more information from the other side so I can get the story more completely. Because, you know, like they say, there's always how many sides to the story? 2 sides? 3, right? There are really 3 sides. There's one side, then there's the other side, and there's what actually happened. So the 2 sides, usually the truth is somewhere, because listen, every story that is shared is missing details, and certain details are shared that stand out in that person's mind. And then the other side will share the same story from their perspective with certain details, some missing, some given, for whatever reason, and then between the 2 you hope to arrive at the real story. Lucifer shared his story. God did not go around sharing his story to the angels, did he? Lucifer was the one busy, so he insinuated a third of the angels who ignored or forgot that God has a side, but because God was not campaigning like Lucifer was campaigning, the angels fell for the insinuations of the campaign. You see the point? Don't fall for those who are campaigning. Remember, not only those who campaign have a just cause. As a matter of fact, usually it's an indicator of maybe the opposite. Today there are many people campaigning to win others' sympathies. Whether it be to agree with them doctrinally and denounce others, whether it be to side with their ministry, whether to be followers of this particular preacher or this particular speaker, and whatever they share openly and more so behind closed doors, quietly, wins people's sympathy and favor because there is a certain campaign. This is a tactic of the enemy. People don't stop long enough to consider, hold on, the other side is not saying anything. Sometimes they take that as a confirmation that the story of the campaigner must be true. Tactics that are happening. So, Absalom was really good at it. Here is what we read as we go on. 2 Samuel 15, verse 5. And it was so that when any man came nigh to him to do him obeisance, he put forth his hand and took him and kissed him. And on this manner did Absalom to all Israel that came to the king for judgment. So Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. So they'd come and bow to him, says, no, don't bow, come up here, and he would kiss them. Imagine these people, how they felt when the son of the king treated them that way. Wow, they loved him. And what did he do? He stole the affections and the hearts of the people to himself. He had a plan. Lucifer acted in a very similar way in heaven as well. We're actually told that Lucifer was retained in heaven for a long time. We're not told how long, but it would have taken time for Lucifer to spread his seeds and influence a third of the angels. Things didn't happen quickly, within a short space of time. It took time. It took a number of years here for Absalom as well. And just like the people didn't see past what Absalom was doing to his inner plan, the angels didn't know Lucifer's plot and plan fully. I want to read the next verse, and this is where it becomes even more interesting with these parallels. Verse 10 and 11. But Absalom sent spies when he saw that his cause was strengthening and he was gaining momentum. Now it was time to act and carry out the next phase of his plan. He sent out spies throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, as soon as ye hear the sound of the trumpet, then ye shall say, Absalom reigneth in Hebron. And with Absalom went 200 men out of Jerusalem that were called. And they went in their simplicity, and they knew not anything. What's that mean? He had invited these people to come to this event he was planning. He sent out spies. He says, listen, we're gonna do this. We're gonna go to Hebron, and when you hear this, the signal, the sound of the trumpet, everyone say, Absalom is king. Long live the king. And he invited people to come along with him as well, 200 of them. It says here, these poor people went along, happy to support Absalom that they've come to love. And in their simplicity, they had no clue that they were involved in a rebellion against the king. Right? That's what it says. They went along, not knowing a thing. Happy-go-lucky. Yeah, there's a party. Let's go. Absalom. Yeah, we love Absalom. Let's go along. And so, using this tactic, Absalom boosted his numbers with people he didn't even realize what was happening. Lucifer did that to a large degree in heaven. You realize that? Very similar tactic. Very similar today. Yes, you want to say something?
It's interesting, I know you both people know Lucifer.
Yes.
He died he could have.
Did David know? Well, we'll get to that because word did get to David. But David did not fully realize what was happening. Absalom worked in secret. He had a very daring plan that probably didn't even cross David's mind until it was too late when he actually realized, as we shall see. But the thing here is this. The result of these tactics, which happen among us as well, is that the same thing occurs. People get told all manner of things. And people get carried away with a particular cause and an agenda that they don't fully understand and realize. And what ends up happening is it causes confusion, alienation, and distrust among those of the own or the same household. Because remember, we have to keep this in context. All this is happening within the household of David, within the one kingdom. Absalom was working within, causing alienation and swinging the people from one side to another, essentially splitting the kingdom. These are the tactics that are used. This is happening among us today as a community of believers. You realize that? Do we discern the tactics? Do we discern what is going on in our own household? As a result of that, the love of many grows cold, which Jesus actually tells us is a sign of the last days. The development of an enemy in one's own house. You see, Absalom, the son of David, was developing and becoming the enemy of David. Lucifer was becoming the enemy and the opposer. And that's what Satan means, the opposer of God. This happens as well. There is a desire for supremacy that motivated Lucifer. It motivated Absalom, and the same as well today. Yes?
You said it took some time.
Mm-hmm.
In verse 7, was that 40 years?
Yes. Okay, I didn't want to deal with verse 7 because verse 7 says 40 years, and that is actually 4 years. It's supposed to be 4 years, not 40 years. That's David's whole reign in Israel was 40 years. Absalom was banished for during David's, the timing doesn't add up for 40 years. That's the word in Hebrew is very close to 4, and that's understood by most commentators that it's referring to 4 years time where Absalom was doing that. But that's a good point, very good question. So, a desire for supremacy to be foremost. Today among us we have this problem, you realize that? Wanting to be the foremost speaker, the most listened to speaker, the most influential ministry perhaps, the ministry that everyone follows and sympathizes with and adheres to. And there are tactics to spread that. Does this sound familiar to anyone, or am I off on a limb all by myself here? I'm talking about issues in our household, right? Issues that develop, that cause alienation, that develop brethren and turn into enemies. using these very same tactics. That's why these stories are so vital for us to understand and be able to discern. And the sad thing is, some people get so carried away with these things, with one cause or another, not discerning the full story. And like these poor people who went with Absalom, they went in their simplicity not knowing anything. That's a very, very sad and real problem today. Some people have a desire to be heard, to be followed, to be respected, to be obeyed. And this desire is what motivated Lucifer on day one. This is a problem, not just among people. This happens in the world. This happens in the church. This happens even among those who stand up to speak. It's something to be mindful of. Just like Absalom wanted to reorganize the kingdom properly. Today we have people who want to organize the work according to what they believe it should be like. It shouldn't run this way. It should run this way, my way. And what ends up happening is many times these tactics are used to gain people's sympathies, to gain people's allegiance to a cause that is greater than they understand or realize. A very serious thing. You understand what I'm talking about? There is, to be open, to speak plainly, among us as a household of faith, when it comes to the community of believers in the Father and the Son, there are a number of speakers and there are a number of ministries. And make no mistake about it, the issues that plague individuals plague the same individuals that are in this household of faith. And there is a certain vying for influence, control, and a setting up of the household according to one's own desires, whether it be individual or a ministry. These issues are happening among us. That's why I want to talk about it, because the tactics that are utilized, brothers and sisters, are tactics that are old, very old, that have been around for a very long time. So, you hear things today like, well, the current setup among us is a mess. It needs to be organized properly. And organized properly means according to what we think. And it seems like there are certain ministries, I'm hearing this more and more, that are vying for the position of being the most influential ministry, or the ministry that sets up the kingdom according to what they believe it should be like. Very dangerous, beware. Can you discern the tactics that are being used? Absalom wanted to be in charge, and when he's in charge, everyone will be happy. Justice will be served. If everyone rallied to him and supported him as king, all will be well. If they didn't, woe unto them. That was Absalom's plan. It's very similar to many things that occur today. You see, to the people, Absalom's cause sounded like a good idea. To the angels, some of Lucifer's points made sense, sounded good, because they were only told part of the story. In like manner today, people hear things that sound good, not realizing fully that there might be a bigger picture and a bigger plan. Beware of these things, these tactics. Now I want to talk about another component here, and this is one of interest, and an interesting detail in the story. In verse 12 of 2 Samuel 15, notice, as we put all this together and make sure we finish on time. 2 Samuel 15:12. And Absalom sent for Ahithophel, the Gileonite, David's counselor, from his city, even from Gilo, while he offered sacrifices, and the conspiracy was strong, for the people increased continually with Absalom. The plot thickens. Absalom sends for one of David's foremost counselors, and he actually joins Absalom's conspiracy and rebellion, Ahithophel. Now this man was a very wise man. And notice how loyalties change and shift. And there's a little detail here that most people miss about this man and why he did what he did. But first of all, what is the significance that this is recorded here? Why did he want to get Ahithophel? Ahithophel was a very wise man. A little later we read in chapter 16, verse 23. And the counsel of Ahithophel, which he counseled in those days, was as if a man had inquired of the oracle of God. So was all the counsel of Ahithophel, both with David and with Absalom. Interesting. This man was so wise, was so discerning, was so insightful, that having him as a counselor and asking his counsel was as if you inquired of God himself. Like he was so spot on, he would give such good counsel. It's like he had this divine enlightenment. It's like asking a prophet of God was asking this counsel of Ahithophel. So Absalom, naturally, wanted Ahithophel on his team. He was a counselor of David. What would get into Ahithophel's mind to join a rebellion and leave David and join with Absalom when he is so wise? Interesting. Here's the little detail. It helps when we understand who Ahithophel was. In 2 Samuel 23:34, we read the following. A list of relationships here. Eliphalet, the son of Ahasbai, the son of Machathite, Eliam, the son of Ahithophel, the Gileonite. And that's what I want to focus on. They're names that sometimes we can't pronounce. But here we're told that Eliam was the son of Ahithophel. That means nothing to most people I know, except if you put it next to this verse in 2 Samuel 11:3, when David sent and inquired after the woman, that is Bathsheba, and one said, "Is not this Bathsheba the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" So, Eliam is the son of Ahithophel. Bathsheba is the daughter of Eliam. Simply, Bathsheba was the granddaughter of Ahithophel, David's counselor. And when David did what he did to Bathsheba, her grandfather was incensed, was outraged. And when the opportunity came in the rebellion of Absalom to turn against David, Ahithophel did it because he was upset that David had defiled his granddaughter and killed his grandson-in-law. And this man was so wise, asking him was like asking the oracle of God. This is a very interesting detail and insight that so many people don't realize. I didn't realize this for a very long time. I heard it one time, thought that makes perfect sense, because why would this wise counselor abandon David? He's the rightful king, and join in a rebellion. Well, he was disgruntled because of what David had done to his granddaughter, no less.
He didn't hang on to the stuff.
For sure. It was not forgotten. And so, upset, offended, disgruntled for years, and when an opportunity came, he joined the rebellion. Today, the same thing happens. People might hear something that upsets them or offends them, and they're disgruntled, and they don't like it, and so they join another cause or another side or another ministry or take another speaker as their favorite or whatever it might be. For whatever reason and purpose, they might have heard something that upset them, annoyed them, or they became disgruntled by it. And so they desired to remedy the hurts and turn enemy to a brother or a sister that they had. Ahithophel turned to be the enemy of David. And he was his faithful counselor for many years. As a matter of fact, it's very powerful. So this puts Bathsheba now in a very different light, hopefully. Her grandfather was a counselor to David. Then it possibly makes sense why her living quarters was not too far from the palace, where when David was walking on the roof of his palace, he could see into their house. That starts to make a little bit more sense now. And why the story is so sordid and so twisted, like almost like a soap opera, That all this was happening within the same houses, on all the tensions and all the dynamics that would have happened, and how this was such an outrageous, horrible sin that David committed that cost him so much. Here we see it with this man, Ahithophel. God forgave David. Ahithophel did not forgive David and did not forget. And when the opportunity came, he took it. You see, many people don't realize this detail was what had motivated Ahithophel to join Absalom. And today, many people don't know the real issues and the details that motivate others to do certain things. What appears on the face is not usually the full story. What I'm saying, brothers and sisters, is simply this. This story teaches us that we are to be very mindful of the whisperings and the things that get told and put in people's ears among us that influence people to make decisions. Beware of campaigns. Beware of stories that gain people's sympathies without hearing the full detail, because there are things that are in people's hearts that are not fully revealed or understood. God is the revealer of the hearts. Finally, as you were saying, David finally gets to hear about this. Verse 13, and there came a messenger to David saying, the hearts of the men of Israel are after Absalom. Finally, the secret conspiracy spills out in public. Rebellion, dissension. You're losing the people, is the message that comes to David. Fomenting for years, now it finally bears visible fruit. Whenever division happens among us, it is not the result of an overnight event. It's something that's been happening for a while. For it to finally become public and bear visible fruit is because things have been growing in the quiet, behind scenes, unbeknown. Finally, David realized, and a little bit too late now, that he has been totally hoodwinked, yes, that's what I'm saying, by his very own son. And he couldn't fix it then and there immediately. It was too late. What he had to do was he had to escape for his life, and that's what he did. Straight away he left the city, because he did not want Absalom to attack the city and have the city actually, people die in the city because they were trying to get him. Today, I am just amazed when I look at the scene among us and see so many of these issues and these tactics at play. And I see people getting caught up in causes that are not fully revealed or understood. And if the stories behind the scenes were told, people's understanding and opinion will be vastly different. What I am sounding is a word of warning and caution. Beware of who you give your ear to allow them to influence you to judge a matter. There's so many people who repeat and parrot what has been placed in their ears, not knowing what they're talking about. You realize that? I get to experience it a fair bit from time to time because, I talk to a lot of people, I travel, and I'm just sharing my little insight of experience as a word of caution. As a matter of fact, I hear something said about me by people that have heard it from someone else, who didn't stop to check the facts of the story and run with it and come to a conclusion and get others to their cause when the reality is a very vast story. These are tactics that are happening among us. We need to stem that tide. Now, I'm not saying this to try and say, look, I'm a victim here. I'm saying this because it just doesn't happen to me. It doesn't just happen to me. It happens to others as well. But I want to be speaking about personal experience here. I'm not trying to drag so many others. There are very challenging times now that we live among us. There are so many people that are disgruntled, that are confused by the alienation, by the differences that exist among us. Theological differences, loyalties to different speakers and ministers and ministries, and what's happening, and joining this ministry and that ministry, and what's going on. And much of it is caused by a lot of whispering and things that are put in people's ears that influence them and win their sympathy one way or another. Beware where you put your sympathies and your judgment, lest you be like those simple 200 folks who went along with Absalom's plan and they had no clue what they were getting themselves into. Beware. That's just the point I want to make. That's just the caution, the warning. That's why it is so vital for us not to be swayed by one side without recognizing the full truth of the matter. And the full truth of the matter doesn't come by listening to this or that, but by personal investigation. Especially when it comes to issues of truth and doctrine. You can't just rely on people and ministries and preachers, including me, to just trust that whatever they say is the truth. You have to test and examine things for yourself. That is vital. And so what I'm saying applies across the board. I'm not saying one side of the story and believe it. All I'm saying is beware who you lend your ears to and what influence you give when you've only heard a partial side of the story, not the full side. That's the key, that's the point. There are always victims and casualties to these conspiracies and schemes. Here it is, 2 Samuel 18, 6 and 7. So the people went out into the field against Israel, and the battle was in the wood of Ephraim, where the people of Israel were slain before the servants of David. And there was there a great slaughter that day of 20,000 men. People died in this conspiracy, in this rebellion. Every time these things happen among us, make no mistake about it, there will be victims. There will be those who will suffer consequences because they get caught up in what actually happens. And for Absalom himself, who was leading this charge, the Bible tells us pride goeth before a fall. And what happened to him is very interesting. Verse 9, Absalom met the servants of David, and Absalom rode upon a mule, and the mule went under the thick boughs of a great oak. And his head caught hold of the oak, and he was taken up between the heaven and the earth, and the mule that was under him went away. Here is Absalom, the handsome prince, the son of the king, whose hair was so notable that it actually is recorded in the scriptures when he cut it and how much it weighed. And his very the reason, or what caused him to be proud, and what he was proud of and distinguished him, became the means of his fall. This time it's not a physical fall off the horse. He was amazingly caught up in the tree. And not long after that, he was killed when Joab came and found him and he killed him. And the news traveled to David in verse 31. And behold, Cushi came, and Cushi said, Tidings, my lord the king, for the Lord hath avenged thee this day of all them that rose up against thee. And the king said unto Cushi, Is the young man Absalom safe? And Cushi answered, The enemies of my lord the king, and all that rise against thee to do thee hurt, be as that young man is. In other words, that's a very polite way to tell the king that your son is dead. But you don't tell that to the king. He says, May all the enemies of the king be like him. And of course, David understood that. And David's reaction is very interesting. Verse 33, And the king was much moved, and went up to the chamber over the gate, and wept. And as he went, thus he said, O my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would God I had died for thee, O Absalom, my son, my son. David must have been thinking of what he had done as well at this time. You know, with Bathsheba and his other son, and he lost his other son. And what his son had done before he died. And then his other son, now Absalom, killed him. And now Absalom rose up against him in rebellion. And now Absalom himself is dead. How much remorse David would have been feeling. And here he's crying over his son, who had become his enemy. And yet he was still his beloved enemy. It's interesting. Here's a father's heart, right? And this was so, unexpected. That Joab, the Bible actually tells us when the soldiers came from the battle, they won, and they heard the king crying over Absalom, they all snuck into the city quietly, ashamed. They just won the battle. And Joab actually went to King David and told him, Listen, what are you doing? You're going to lose the kingdom now. This will be worse than what Absalom has done. You're crying over your dead son Absalom, who wanted to kill you. And these people risked and hazarded their lives to save the kingdom. And some of them died. And you're crying over your son Absalom? Wake up. So David went down to the gate and he welcomed the army, and the people came, and it was a terrible tragedy. What it is basically saying is this: it was an absolute terrible tragedy in Israel. A household divided, where the members of the one household became enemies and fought, and there was death and heartache and discord and division and tears and bloodshed. A sad, very sad tragedy. This was not the enemies of Israel attacking and the enemies of God's people. This was an in-house problem that plagued and hurt David more than any of the enemies from without could do. And today, brothers and sisters, our greatest fear is from within than from without. What could cause us the greatest anguish and heartache is from our own household. That's why Jesus says, listen, love your enemies and pray for them. And guess what? A man's enemies are they of his own household. But the amazing thing is, here is David's heart towards his enemy, who acted his enemy, towards his son. He cried over his son. He was his beloved enemy. How is it with us? While I want to sound a word of warning, I also want to sound a word of heart examination. How do we react when alienation springs up among us? Do we take sides and consider enemies our own brothers who might even differ with us in ideas and doctrine? Or do we still love our perceived enemies? That's a question. Here is David's heart. The amazing thing is, the same is a reflection also of God's own heart. Who is God's greatest enemy? God's greatest enemy, I would suggest it's Lucifer. He spent the longest with God. He's of God's own household. He's his own creation. His own close covering cherub who turned against him and caused so much heartache and turmoil in the universe, that caused the very death of the Son of God, caused the fall of humanity, and all these things that resulted. And here is what God says about Lucifer. Very interesting parallel. Ezekiel 28, verse 11 and 12. Moreover, the word of the Lord came unto me, saying, Son of man, take up a lamentation upon the king of Tyrus, and say unto him, Thus saith the Lord God, Thou sealest up the sum, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. This is a symbol here, the king of Tyrus, for Lucifer. But notice what God tells Ezekiel. He says, take up a lamentation. What does lamentation mean? A sad thing. There is a book in the Bible called Lamentations. And what they are, or it's Jeremiah weeping and crying over the fate of Israel and the loss of Israel going into captivity. He's lamenting. And his heart is going out to Israel. And here God tells Ezekiel, listen, here is my heart towards my enemy, this son that rebelled against me. Take up a lamentation, not a curse, not a condemnation, which Lucifer is very deserving of. The father's heart towards his enemy is take up a lamentation. You know, that never struck me before. So many times I'd read this verse until one day I realized it says a lamentation. And when God goes on to describe Lucifer and how beautiful and perfect in beauty and in the day he was created, what you're seeing is like what many times happens in a funeral, where the deeds and the outstanding things of the person are repeated, and people are lamenting the loss of that loved one. God is here lamenting the loss of his son Lucifer. Doesn't say serves you right, there you go, now you got it. He's lamenting. Kind of like David says, oh my son Absalom, if I would just died for you. Beloved enemy, how do we deal with those of our own household? Do we justify that because they think different, they acted this way towards us? We justify that we dislike them, and we treat them as enemies. It's easy to love the enemies we don't see, but this one here, no, we don't go there, we don't listen to him, we don't go to this speaker. All these loyalties that are, contradictory among us are a problem, brothers and sisters. Loving our enemies is impossible by trying harder. Loving our enemies, they of our own household, is only possible by the Spirit of God. Many times we confuse loving someone with condoning or agreeing with what they have done or said. And we think that we don't agree with what they said, we don't condone what they believe, and so we can't really love them because that would support a wrong or an error. And we shouldn't really confuse the two. God did not or does not condone or agree with what Lucifer has done. And yet he is lamenting over him. You do realize God loves Lucifer, right? I hope you realize that. His own enemy, who caused the death of his very own son. It makes a little bit more sense perhaps when you look at, say, the story of David and Absalom. It makes sense to us as parents and children that we still love even our wayward children. We might not agree with their waywardness, we love them. And yet, strangely enough, when it comes to the family of faith, our brothers and sisters and believers, we justify alienation, animosity because of differences and say, well, I don't want to support that. And so we withhold actually love. We end up with trouble. Beware of the tactics of the enemy. Beware of what is happening among us. Don't forget the silent voice too, that we mentioned. Those who might not campaign as much. You see, this is why Jesus says that in the end days, the love of many will grow cold. Don't let Satan's tactics freeze the love of God in your heart, where it becomes only to those who agree with you or those who are your neighbors. That's what the Pharisees end up concluding. Love your neighbors, hate your enemies. And Jesus said to them, listen, it has been said, you have heard it said, but I say unto you, do that. Last verse I'll close with, and this is the only way this is possible. Romans 5:5 says the following, and hope maketh not ashamed, because the love of God is shed abroad in our hearts by the Holy Spirit, which is given unto us. If this is something you're struggling with, you find difficult, pray about it, because it's not possible in our own strength. To love those that we perceive as our enemies is a miracle of divine doing. It's only possible by the Spirit of God, shed abroad in our hearts when it's given to us. That's the miracle. Without that, it is impossible to love your enemies. So, that's the challenge of this study. How do you deal with the issues that are happening in our own household? Is your love growing cold? Do you have enemies? Or can you be like David and even God himself and have beloved enemies? Challenging enough? So I'll leave it at that. Let's close with a word of prayer. I pray you were blessed by this video. Be sure to subscribe to our channel, like, turn notifications on, and most importantly, share this video with others. May God the Father richly bless you in Jesus.